It's Captain Matt, Boater Secret Weapon, here with Jack Ferguson. We're going to talk about the problem with Mercury Outboards. And Jack happens to be a Master Certified Tech, which is the highest level of certification. So he knows his stuff. And Jack, thank you for sharing this. What are some of the common problems with the Mercury Outboards?
With Mercury Outboards, we've got a couple different levels of Mercury Outboards. So let's start with, let's say, a very popular line, the Inline 6 Verado. This thing's been made from, I believe it's 2002 till about 2018, where they discontinued and went to their newer lines. But most of your boaters between 2002 and 2018 are going to have this. It's a great inline 6 or inline 4 supercharged motor with low compression, so they usually last a long time. What we see a lot of failures with on these engines are usually thermostats, as well as spun hubs and lower units. So the majority of the problem is not with the engine itself. And we're going to kind of go over what we can do to prevent these problems as well. So on thermostats, that would be what I consider the number one problem with specifically Verados, is that they do have a change interval. Most people don't realize they actually say pull and inspect every 100 hours, but they don't say change it every 100 hours. Now, most Mercury assumes that these thermostats are going to fail open and that they run dead cold. And I do see that quite often, but on the occasion I see it stick closed. And when it sticks closed, you have an overheat. We can tell that we have a thermostat problem from two ways. Almost all Mercury products, all outboards, run at the same temperature now. So this temperature basically goes across all outboards. And most other outboard products have also adapted this temperature. It's about 140 degrees. It's pre-salt buildup, but it does get the engine hot enough to continue to run and have a really good time in the water. So if we see that the engine never gets above, let's say 130 degrees, we're looking at a thermostat that's stuck open. It's just not getting hot enough. Now, on the other hand, and I've seen this in two ways, we'll talk about it. A thermostat where we're getting, 160 degrees, where the engine's running at 160, not 140, not 120, but a little hot. If you were to rev it up and it goes away, the issue is not necessarily the thermostat, it's the water flow. So that eliminates the thermostat. But if it stays at 160, then you're looking at a stuck thermostat, one that's stuck at a very specific open position. And they're super easy to change on all the Verado product, as long as you have, if it's ever been changed before. If they've been changed before, they have when they're brand new, they have a cutoff clamp. Basically, you have to cut it off. But whenever anybody changes them, I've seen them where they just use a regular hose clamp that you tighten. It's 2 bolts, 8 millimeter, right off the side. There's nothing in front of it. It's just ready to come off and change. So what I would say is, to prevent this problem, I would recommend changing it no less than every 3 years or 300 hours. If you're putting more than 300 hours on it, it needs to be changed.
Does it matter salt water or fresh water, in your opinion?
As long as you're flushing it, no. But if you're not flushing it, then salt water needs to be changed significantly more often, usually once a year. And that's because salt will build eventually. You get what's called radiant heat, which is, let's say when the engine shuts down, what happens is the engine area under the cowling instantly raises by 30 degrees. The water stops flowing, the hot exhaust, the hot cylinder head, they're all still there, and they radiate heat out. So what happens is the salt tends to crystallize during that time. It doesn't crystallize while you're running, it crystallizes when you shut down.
Yeah.
So if you use salt away or you freshwater flush your motor, you go a tremendous way to prevent that problem from happening. But we do have people that we see out here in Southern California that they could care less about flushing. It's about them getting on and off the boat in 15 minutes. Somebody else will put the cover on and clean the boat and all that kind of stuff. So they usually pay a significant amount more in maintenance. So as far as that goes, yes, salt water has a higher tendency to change, but it also is about, are you flushing your outboard?
Yeah, how you taking care of it?
Mm-hmm. Because if you look at Mercury Marine's specification, it's anytime you run in salt water after you shut down, flush it. And there have been times where people call Mercury for failed components due to salt water, and they ask you, okay, it's not just about at the end of your trip, like let's say you've been gone 7 days. They actually talked about it at the end of the day. If you're not going to be using that engine for 12 or 16 hours or a day, it's just sitting in the water, it should be flushed so salt water isn't continuing to get into the cast iron or the aluminum or whatever in the engine that you have. They don't want any salt to creep in there.
Critical. So that's the Verado. Is there anything else on the Verado that we need to talk about, or can we move to the 4-stroke?
We're going to move to the 4-stroke. The Verado will have one last thing to get to, but I think that'll kind of be at the end because it does apply to a different engine as well. So the new V6 V8s, but first we'll get to the 4-stroke smaller product. So we have basically...
So this is up to 115, the 150, or you going, when you say smaller?
We're going to start with really small, like 2 horse to 25 horse.
Perfect.
And the reason I talk about this is because these engines are made by Taihatsu. So Mercury and Taihatsu are actually the same company when it comes to 0 to 25 horsepower. And they used to actually go up to 50 horsepower, but now that's done. Taihatsu does make an excellent product. I had an older Taihatsu 2-stroke for many, many years, and the thing ran fantastic. But on the Taihatsus and the little ones, what we're seeing, especially on the single-cylinder units, is that the spark that they use for the little engines actually tends to kill spark plugs. The most common issue isn't overheating. It isn't anything like that. It's actually spark plug failure. And I've had this happen to a couple people. And we had just a little example of a 6 horsepower. Somebody was going from their larger boat over to an island. They were just cruising in on a little, about a 12-foot dinghy. And they had a 6 horsepower Mercury. And what happened was on the way there, it was fine. Trying to start it up. Once it was on land, it wouldn't start again. When I went to diagnose it, because he's somebody who doesn't have any mechanical experience, nor does he want it, I found that the spark plug had stopped sparking. So first I had checked all my basics, the ignition coil, all that kind of stuff. The kill lanyard in, really easy things to check first. Kill lanyard would be one. Try pulling a little harder. Outwards, it would be to check if your little oil light is functioning on the smaller outboards. They have a little red light that'll go out as the oil pressure rises, and those lights can die and actually kill spark sometimes. And then eventually I got down to the spark plug. And since it's a single cylinder motor, once a spark plug breaks, you got nothing.
That's important.
So what I recommend is on those little smaller outboards, keep a set of pre-gapped spark plugs with you on those little outboards that are 25 horsepower and less. Their ignition system is really harsh on spark plugs. And Mercury, I don't see anybody on a 25 or lower ever making the 100 or 300 hours for those units. I don't see it happening. So I usually say every year, change out spark plugs. They can die in the middle of the year. It does happen. I have seen it. But I just recommend doing it once a year and then keeping a set of pre-gapped spark plugs. Gap is really important too. If you've ever been to an auto parts store, they sell that round little thing that everybody puts on their keychain that's a spark plug gap tool. Look under the cowling. This is pretty much any outboard now. I've seen it with Yamaha, Honda, Mercury. They all give you the specification for what spark plug you need, and it says what gap to set it to. So the gap is just important as the plug. So always make sure to gap it. And if you don't want to gap it there, just gap it and then put it right back in the little box that you bought it from, so that when it needs to be changed, you can just change it out real quick.
Yeah, and cheap and easy insurance.
I mean, spark plugs are only a couple dollars. And most outboards, especially the smaller ones, come with a tool bag when you buy them new that has a spark plug wrench and a flathead Phillips to drain the carburetor bowl. A lot of times, people don't know that tool that has a little handle and it's got 2 ends on it that comes with the outboard is not just for replacing spark plugs. If it has a flathead blade on one side, it's for draining the carburetor out for winterization.
Interesting.
Yeah. So it's supposed to be your tool for winterization, so you can remove the plug, put oil in the cylinder, turn it over by hand and then put the spark plug back in and then drain your carburetor so there's nothing left to sit and corrode in the carburetor bowl if you have ethanol.
Interesting. Okay, so that's the up to 25.
Correct.
What's the next batch that you want to talk about?
We go usually to 40 to 60 horsepower, which are what I would call the Chinese motors. So 40 and 60 horsepower, they used to be made in the US. You can tell via your serial number of the product. If it has a C in the serial number, that stands for China. It's the Chinese product.
I didn't know that.
Yeah. So that's mainly your 40 and 60 horse engines. So it'll be like a 0C or a 2C or whatever. Mainly Mercury Outboards right now are in the Bs or the Cs, or not Cs, the Ds. So what you'd have is like a standard outboard product right now, as I think one I saw yesterday was a 3B 228 is what the current line is. And I can usually gauge how old a product is by those numbers as well. So Mercury does a really nice system on their serial numbers. It's just an alphanumeric number. Their stern drives are 2 Apple. Their outboards that are made in Fond du Lac, Wisconsin are going to be a B number, and then C is China. And as far as the Chinese product line goes, there's not actually, they make a pretty darn bulletproof 40 to 60 horsepower outboard. Those things run really, really well. The only problem really that I've seen as far as things go right out of the box is fuel. Kind of going back to fuel contamination, all that kind of stuff. They use this weird fuel injection system. It looks kind of like a spider. If you take the cowling off and you look on the starboard side, looking sideways, you're going to kind of tell what I mean. It's got this circular thing with little plastic fuel lines that go to injectors. And they do it because it's cheaper. I mean, the 40 to 60 horse, they tried to lower their price by moving the product to China. And it's not a bad product because the Mercury engineers are still over there. The labor is a little cheaper. And that product as well has all the features of the bigger product, meaning you can still have all your SmartCraft gauges, you can have displays, you can have all different kinds of different features, troll control, everything. But what I see is fuel injection system problems as far as when you get contamination, you have to replace pretty much the entire system in its entirety. It's unfortunate. There's nothing as far as the system failing. I haven't seen anything there, but when somebody leaves it over winter full of fuel, they get the ethanol that separates and then turns to sand. And then the moment you start it, all that sand runs through the injectors in this manifold housing. They don't really come apart very well. So when I see any kind of contamination, it's complete replacement of the fuel system. But the lower units are bulletproof. They come with command thrust as well. So if you want a bigger lower unit for a fatter boat that goes slow, we see a lot of lobster boats out here that carry them commercially. A lot of barges carry them that are like in the harbor doing the pylons. We see the little outboards move a huge boat. That's typically what they've got out here. But they're really good engines.
Okay, that's awesome. So now let's take the step up. So what is it, 75 to 75? Is that the right bucket?
75, 90, 115. I think it's 135 and 150. They're all the same engine. They used to be 2 different engines. So you used to have the 75, 90, and then the 115 and the 150. Right. But now it's the same. The nice thing for people who stock parts for these is that the product is now the same. They just changed the throttle body and the computer mapping and such like that. So this product, I don't like it as much as the older product. The old 75, 90, 115s or 75 and 90s were inline 4s with FSMs, fuel supply modules. They used to carry a lot of Verado product on them. So the where they got developed from was Verado. So Verado was the main product, and then a lot of stuff offshot from that. Because before that, you had Yamamerc engines, which were Yamaha engines that had Mercury cowlings on them. Or you had Yamaha cowlings that had Mercuries in them. It was the same thing. Either way, the 75, 90, 115, that engine is the problem I see mainly with that is that it seems to clog, the cooling system seems to clog very often with it. And it also happens inside basically you have the engine, which is on top, the lower unit, which is on the bottom, the midsection, which is in the middle, and then there's this plate that sandwiches the engine and the midsection and everything all together. And what I see is if you're not using salt away on these products and you're using it in salt water, they clog. And that requires a lot of disassembly because you've ruined the lower unit, the midsection, the engine. So what do we do to prevent that? Salt away. And you can usually tell this is clogged because what will happen with your 7590 115 is that you usually have an exhaust vent right above the water that's right on the back of the unit. It's near the telltale, and it lets little puffs of air out when you're just idling. That will be spitting water. If it's spitting a ton of water straight backwards, like a good volume of it, that means that the water that should be draining into that midsection area is not draining. There's not enough. Yeah, it's not going down. And so it's shooting that water out the back of the outboard. Besides that, they use a more universalized fuel supply module now. So that fuel supply module has very little problems. They used to have one with a float switch in it. It had 12 wires coming out of it. There was so many electronics in that thing. It was crazy. Now they've eliminated it. It's 2 wires, positive, negative. So they've lowered the failure rate of the fuel supply module. Back in the day, if you have an earlier 7590, what would happen is that it had a float in there to tell it when there was enough fuel. It acted like a carburetor bowl. There was a float that would drop, but it was electric. And the computer would tell the low pressure fuel pump to start sucking fuel from the tank and fill it till it's full again. And what would happen is that float would fail because it was a mechanical moving part. And when it failed, it would go, they had a line that would go into the intake manifold and it would dump fuel into the intake manifold. But there's a little valve in there that would go high. And what would happen is there would be a code set. It wouldn't alarm, but there would be a code for, like I believe it was vent canister valve, and it would shut. And when it shut, you had about 2 minutes before that engine would completely shut down. It ran out of fuel. Yeah. And those engines, it would usually be a 7590 without a primer bowl because they told you.
Do you remember what year range that was?
I believe they discontinued that engine in 2013.
Okay.
From 2013 on, they got their newer generation of
the simpler version of the fuel system.
Mm-hmm. Everything became simpler. The older style had a different style ignition system. It was a big, fat ignition coil that was all independent. These new ones use universalized ignition coils. So what would happen with these is if you have one spark plug die, it would kill 2 cylinders on the new unit. On the old one, it wouldn't do that. But if you had a failure of the ignition coil, it would kill all 4 cylinders because it was a bigger unit. So these new ones as well, that's the same ignition coil that comes on most of the outboard product. You probably see it. It comes on the new Mercruiser stern drive. It's one part number. So the stern drive units use it and the outboards use it now, as well as the new V6, V8 outboards use it. So this ignition coil has become a really universalized item. Very low failure rate. I haven't seen, I saw one fail, only one, in my entire time working here with the new product line, only one. It was a under warranty thing. The rest of it has always been wiring. Some wire is broken. But the new 7590 115s, the other thing is on those, I found that the thermostat sticks open. I haven't seen them stick closed and overheat. I've seen them stick open and run dead cold. So
is that an issue in salt, or is it not a big deal?
That's an issue if you basically you need that thermostat always, but that issue tends to crop up more in salt water that's really cold or fresh water that's really cold. The cold water, what happens is you're running for a long time and it's nice and warm, and then you shut down all the water drains out of the motor, and you start back up and it hits the thermostat with 50-degree water and it shocks the thermostat.
Okay.
So that, I don't understand why the Verado doesn't have that style of problem, but this engine does.
Okay,
So,
interesting.
yeah.
Interesting. Okay, so now let's move to the next bucket.
Okay, so basically we'd be moving into what's now either a small Verado product or the new V6 product line. So the new V6, as funny as it sounds, I don't like the new product line as much as I like the old one. It doesn't mean it's not good. Yeah.
Yeah.
The new product line gets better fuel economy by, I would say, about 10%. Not a big deal for people who are bass boaters that are running wide open, because a wide open, if you have a 300 horse, it's going to burn 300 horsepower worth of fuel. But if you're in the cruising range, if you're a cruising boat, it does get better fuel economy. These boats also have a lot of new features, as well as they're able to communicate on your phone now. So if you install a little device on these, you can have it to your phone, and it'll remind you when it's time to, grease the tilt tube, or change the oil, or change the lower unit oil, stuff like that. Or it goes to your phone, it tells you have a code and shows you the code. Because on new products, if it's an emissions code or a code to do with any kind of emissions related item, it doesn't show the code on your display on your screen. Like your tachometer, it won't say that you have a code.
Yep.
But if you have a vessel view, it'll tell you have it. That product line, what I've seen the most with it right now is actually harnessing problems. And I know this sounds weird, but this product line really came out during COVID. And I think the problem is not necessarily with the engine itself. I think it was during COVID, a lot of the people that were working were no longer employed that had been doing this for years, because this product came out in like 2019, 2020. 2019 engines I found are fine, but anything 2020 to 2021 had a span of problems. And this goes for boats too. I saw a lot of boats with a lot of problems from 2020 to 2021. But they had problems with their ignition coil clips. So when a lot of people thought they had failed ignition coils, and would swap them out, change them over, and they go, oh, the ignition coil, if I move it from one cylinder to the other, it doesn't change the problem. The problem still stays over here. It's found that a lot of the harnessing that they made, the little connectors, the pins inside the harness, they were broken. So the issue was on the assembly line when quality control checked it. It didn't quite check out, but they didn't find it in time, so it was sent out to people. And these problems didn't get found out until over 100 hours in. So it seemed like a good product. As far as it goes, with the actual product itself, the V6, the only difference between all the V6s is the calibration of the computer. So it's like the 150 all the way to the 225 or the 250. I can't remember exactly when they changed, but it's right above 225, 250, right in there. They're all the same engine. So there is no difference. It's just the computer. As far as the emission system goes, there's no catalytic converter in these things. They were thinking they were going to have it. They didn't. But I can't really find a whole lot of problems with the powerhead itself. One issue that I found that is transferred from the V6 and the V8, so all of the new ones, is actually a plate underneath the impeller is allowing air to get in. If you're having weird overheating problems that don't make sense, typically you have your impeller, and it's the same impeller that they've used for like all their big outboard products forever. They've used it in the Verado. They've used it in the Mercruiser Alpha Drive. They've used it in now their new V6 V8s. But what they've changed is the plate that the impeller sits on is now aluminum instead of stainless. And that aluminum plate corrodes and it bends up in a corner. And when it bends up in a corner, the engine has a tendency not to overheat, but run hot.
Yeah.
So it'll run at like 160, 170, 180, and the thermostat's still 140. So that's the problem I'm seeing with these new ones is when you do an impeller change, you always got to change the plate in the bottom.
Okay, interesting.
Yeah,
interesting.
I've never had to do that before. Usually you can just get away with an impeller if you don't need the whole housing. Can't do that anymore. You got to do the housing and everything.
Okay, that's interesting. Yeah, it's amazing as they change the materials that they're using to make them cheaper and cheaper. Things going plastic that used to be metal. It causes issues. It causes extra maintenance. All right, so let's move to the next round.
Okay.
Have you worked on the 600? Any of those? You have much experience with those engines?
No, but I do work closely with somebody who does. 600s to do those, it's actually outside of the realm of Master Tech. You don't, to be a Master Tech, you don't need to be certified in 600s. 600 has its own very specific, what would you call it, certification. And we decided there was a lot of work we already had with everything else that we didn't want to take on a new product. They are having issues. I know they probably don't want to talk about those issues, but as far as the issues go with that, they have the 600, the 500 commercial, and then the 400 V10. So those are the new products that they've come out with. And the V12 is what I've seen is what it is. I can't remember if it's a Borg Warner or Velvet, or Borg Warner Velvet, which I believe it is, or a ZF Hearth. I'm pretty sure it's a ZF Hearth pod style. Because ZF made the pods for Mercury Mercruiser for a long time back when they had Zeus.
Okay, sure.
And what I've seen failures with so far is they've had a lot of fuel module problems. A lot of fuel module problems, a lot of harnessing issues in the boat in general. But as far as the engine goes, when it runs really well, really smooth. One of the smoothest engines I've been on. I got to be on a brand new Bertram here a little while ago. I was there for the generator, but the technician for the engine was there, and I was discussing problems with him because our company has decided not to do 600s, but there are other companies that do it. And there were fuel module problems and thermostat housing problems. The thermostat housing, I believe, is made out of plastic, and it's warping really bad. And they're having issues of its warping and leaking. Same with the water pump. The water pump housings are having really bad problems of warping. They're actually saying to put a bond of silicone around it to try to keep it from leaking all over the place. I think they're trying to figure out what material is going to work best. And the reason for this, I believe, and this is the first of its kind, so I understand that there are going to be problems.
Yeah, for sure.
But I think the problem ends up being is that in a standard outboard, you have the impeller in between the lower unit and the midsection. So it's typically under the water or right next to the water. So it's always getting blasted with water. The impeller housing on the 600 is high. So not only is it having to pull water, when you're running, it's not getting water sprayed all over it. So a plastic housing and not getting water sprayed all over it is not good for longevity. Yeah. Inboards are able to do that because they have bronze or copper nickel pumps, and so those copper nickel pumps are able to deal with any kind of heat, as well as they're a different style of pump. If you look at an outboard, it's a very wide pump. It's a volume pump, not a pressure pump. If you look at inboards, it's usually a pressure style pump. They pull a lot harder. Volume pumps do not pull. They only deliver a volume of water.
Yeah. So you got to work extra hard, being up high, being in that material. Interesting. Mm-hmm. Interesting. Yeah. Do you have any experience with the Pro XF?
The Pro XF. I'd have to take a look at what it looks like, but not. I would say probably not, unless it's a horsepower designation.
Okay, the Pro XS.
The Pro XS. Okay.
Yeah. I'll call it the two-stroke equivalent of a four-stroke, higher RPM. You'll see them on bass boats. You see them on pontoons, which I think is odd. They run at higher RPM. They've mainly built them for the bass boat community. I didn't know if you saw those out there much or not.
We don't deal that's one that I would say I have very little experience in, and it's because mainly what I deal with is ocean boats. And so the Pro XS is not seen out here. So I won't say that I have experience in it just because I'm not in the area where I would see that. I see a lot more 600s. I see a lot of 600s. I don't necessarily work on them, but I work with people who work on them. So I see a lot of the issues, especially because I'll stock parts that they may happen to need right at that time. But as far as the Pro XS goes, I don't have a lot of experience with that specific model.
Okay, cool. Well, so if you need any assistance, if you got a Mercury and you're having some issues, you can give Jack check him out at his website, or give him a call, and he'd be able to help you out. And again, if you're in the Irvine, Southern California area, you need somebody that you can trust, check him out there.